Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Danbury. My name is Todd. My pronouns are he, him, and I'll be your service coordinator today. If you haven't had a chance to silence your phones yet, please do so now. As always, let's respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Pequawset people. And there's still no update on whether the BIA is going to allow them to reapply for federal recognition. Nothing's happened on that front yet. So let's take a moment to wave hello to the folks joining us online and say hi to your neighbor. Thank you, Maisie. Maisie was our chime ringer this morning. A few announcements. After the service today, there will be a tour of the cottage house and a discussion about what we want to do with it going forward. It's old, as you know, and it requires a lot of maintenance, and it's time we figured out what we want to do. No decisions have been made, and all ideas are welcome. So if you have the time and you're interested, there will be a tour and discussion after the service. It'll probably start right here in the fellowship hall at, I would guess, around 11:20 as coffee hour is winding down. And then there will be a Zoom discussion on the same topic on Wednesday evening, I think at 7 o'clock. So anyway, there's more information in your order of service on that. Tomorrow is International Transgender Day of Visibility. That's to celebrate the joy and the resilience of transgender and non-binary folks everywhere. I'm not aware of any events or observances in Danbury or the immediate area, but I know there's something going on in Bridgeport at the Government Center, and I think that is at 3 o'clock. In Middletown, they have something going on at 5 o'clock. That's Middletown, not Middlebury. And in the city at Union Square, there is an event at 4 o'clock tomorrow. And so, I mean, if you can make it to any of those events, wonderful. If you can't, I think a good way to mark the occasion would be to continue with, or begin, if you haven't already started, the online Trans Inclusion in Congregations program presented by the Transforming Hearts Collective. And instructions for signing into that and logging into that are also in your order of service. And now Sierra Marie has a very important announcement about bunny money.
Okay, so some of you were here a few weeks ago when the kids introduced their playground project proposal to you and started recruiting volunteers and started raising some seed money for that project. As you know, every year we do a unique non-traditional egg hunt. Each year it's different. So this year we thought we'd support the kids in their fundraiser for the playground by raising money and giving them a chance to count how much money they've raised by putting symbolic bunny money in the eggs. If you could help us know how much bunny money to print by letting us know how much you'll donate to their Easter egg fundraiser, that would be great. You can sign up on this sign up sheet. I'll leave it out in the foyer, and just let us know how much you're going to give, and we'll print the bunny money and put it in the Easter eggs. Thanks so much.
And now Nancy Hirschhatter. Do you have an announcement for us about the UUCD Passover Potluck Seder?
Yes. April 13th, which is 2 weeks from today, at 5 p.m., there will be everyone is welcome, families, children, Jewish, never been to a Seder, and everything in between. Here in Fellowship Hall, it will be potluck. And there is a sign-up genius that will be going around, and you can say how many people are coming and what you'd like to bring. And the The other folks you can talk to about it are Judy Lacker and Luann Villani. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. The UUCD potluck Passover Seder is always one of the highlights of the UUCD social calendar for the year. So today, our guest speaker is Deb Tickle. And a cradle, I'll read the introduction. A cradle Episcopalian, Deb Tickle has extensive experience in youth ministry and congregational development, and has held secular employment in public relations and event planning in both the for-profit and not-for-profit arenas. Deb grew up in Connecticut, spending her childhood in the nearby towns of Brookfield and Bridgewater. In 2005, she and her then young family relocated to the Phoenix Valley in Arizona. After 18 years away, she returned to Connecticut in 2023. While in Arizona, she served for nearly a decade as youth director at St. Peter's Litchfield Park, where during her tenure, the 6th through 12th grade youth groups grew to include 75 students. Together with her now wife, an Episcopal priest, she co-founded the Emmaus Episcopal Church community in Surprise, Arizona. When Emily was called to another parish, Deb continued to lead the Emmaus community for over 5 years as solo lay missioner vicar, responsible for liturgy planning, officiating, and preaching weekly worship services in person and online, pastoral care, Christian formation, and community and ministry development. She also served the Diocese of Arizona as a facilitator of anti-racism training and as a catalyst for the establishment of a committee for LGBTQIA+ inclusion and ministry. She's a wife, mother of 2 amazing young adults, and human companion to a beloved and overly possessive cat and an adoring black lab. We're very excited to have Deb with us, and I look forward to her sermon today. It'll be called Finding the Courage to Act. But before we get to the sermon, we will begin with the lighting of our chalice. Sterling, I believe, is going to help us light the chalice. And if you'll join me in the words to the chalice lighting affirmation. You got it. Thank you. Love is the spirit of this congregation, and justice is its light. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek and speak the truth in love, to help one another and celebrate life. And now please rise as you are able for our hymn of welcome, Gather the Spirit, number 347.
Gather the Spirit, harvest the power. Our separate fires will kindle one flame. Witness the mystery of this hour. Our trials in this light appear all the same. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. Gather the spirit of heart and mind. Seeds for the sowing are laid in store. Nurtured in love and conscience refined. With body and spirit united once more. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. Gather the spirit growing in all, drawn by the moon and fed by the sun. Winter to spring and summer to fall, the chorus of life resounding as one. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather passion and strength, gather to celebrate once again.
Let's say our children's affirmation. The words are on the screen. We are Unitarian Universalists. We are people with open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. We care for the earth and each other. Today's story comes from the Christian tradition. Jesus was a great teacher, even though he lived a long, long time ago. His words of truth and love, the stories he told, and the stories about his life are still being told today. You might remember that we told the story of his birth back in December in our Christmas pageant. When Jesus was alive, often people followed him around and asked him questions. Sometimes he told them stories called parables so that they could understand the answers to these big questions. One day, a person asked him what the most important thing in life was, and Jesus said, "You already know." "That is true," said the person. "I do. It is to love God and to love my neighbors as I love myself." The person paused a moment and thought. He then asked another question. "But who is my neighbor?" So Jesus, the great teacher, told this parable, the story we're about to tell. We need a road for this story. Where could we imagine a road? We need a long road here. Where could we imagine this in our room? Right there, Maisie, you think? From here to here? So this road stretches from Jerusalem to Jericho. And I have some volunteers to play some of the parts in this story. Could I have volunteer number 1 come walk on our road? There was once someone who went from Jerusalem down to Jericho. As he went along, he was attacked by robbers. They hurt him, they took everything he had, and left him by the side of the road, half dead. All right, volunteer 2. There was an important person traveling the same road, someone you might expect to be a helper. Who are some of the people known in our time as helpers in our communities in Connecticut? Firefighters, doctors, paramedics, social workers. Sorry? Boy Scouts. Moms and dads. Teachers, nurses, ministers. So in this story, this important person who you would expect to be a helper was also traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. When they came to the person who had been hurt, had everything taken from him, and had been left by the side of the road half dead, they did not stop. They crossed to the other side of the road and kept walking. There was also someone else traveling on the road this day, volunteer 3. This person was known for being very smart and was another person who you might expect would be a helper. But when they came to the person who had been hurt, who had everything taken from him and had been left by the side of the road half dead, they too did not stop. They crossed to the other side of the road and kept walking. There was also a person who went on the road who did not live in Jerusalem. This person was visiting from a country called Samaria. The people in Samaria did not even like the people in Jerusalem, and the people in Jerusalem did not like the people from Samaria. But even though the people from Samaria did not like the people from Jerusalem, when the stranger came to where the person had been hurt, had everything taken from him, had been left by the side of the road half dead, he went to him and he put some medicine on the places where the person was hurt and gave a coat to him and put this hurt person on a donkey and took him to a place to spend the night. The stranger even stayed with him all the night and in the morning, and he gave the innkeeper enough money for him to stay there until he was well. So ends the story. I'm going to invite, let's have Maisie. Would you mind getting our basket for our collection of food for Dorothy Day Hospitality House? If you have some food, please hold it up so the kids can see you. They will come around to collect it and put it in the basket. And Nell, I'm going to have you light the lantern. We'll sing this little light of mine together.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
It's time now for the sharing of our milestones, silent and spoken. If there is something you've been carrying in your heart or something that's been on your mind, and you'd like to commemorate that silently, please come forward now, and you're welcome to place a stone or two in the bowl.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life a shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
When you give of your time and energy to this congregation, you're giving gifts to each other. And when you contribute to its financial support, you're doing the very same thing. There are many ways to give. You can give online at the website. You can send a check to 24 Clapboard Ridge Road. There's a QR code on the screen. And our greeters will be passing the offertory plates around. And thank you very much for your generosity.
We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change and life from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now. What a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change and life from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love.
You know, we had that song by video a few weeks ago, and that was great. But I'll take a live performance by Jerry any day. That was beautiful. We're very lucky. Today's reading, it comes from the Bible, and so I brought my grandmother's family Bible with me. Her name was Mima Viola Jolly Tuttle. She was born in 1888 in a polygamist family in the Utah Territory. And despite the differences in our spiritual leanings, I like to think that she'd be happy that it ended up on my shelf. So our reading comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 13. It'll be verses 31 to 35. Therefore, when he was gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God be glorified in him, God shall also glorify him in himself, and shall straightway glorify him. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. Ye shall seek me, and as I said unto the Jews, whither I go, ye cannot come. So now I say to you, a new commandment I give you, that ye love one another. As I have loved you, that ye also love one another. And by this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." And now our message from Deb Tickle, Finding the Courage to Act.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. I should say, as I tell my congregation every week, that the minute I've changed my glasses, I can see what I've prepared, but probably not you. So if anything strikes you that you need to say, wave strongly, and maybe I'll pick that up. I do want to thank Reverend Tony, even in his absence, for inviting me to be with you today, and to everyone who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to put together the service this morning. I'm excited to be here, so thank you for the warm welcome. And I have to admit that I was a bit startled to receive Reverend Tony's text message inviting me, and still a little bit more perplexed when I started trying to understand the assignment. His initial invitation came explaining that the theme of the month was trust and faith, and that after the sermon delivered by Episcopal Bishop Marion Buddy at the National Cathedral following the January inauguration, he thought that perhaps as a fellow Episcopalian, I could speak a bit to what my faith calls me to, specifically in terms of justice and the work of justice. So I'm going to try. And the more I've thought about that request since, the more I've realized that it's a conversation that does intersect very deeply with my personal story. And I've realized along that thought pain just how hard it is to put those words together, to share outside of my own brain, because it means reliving, painful experiences in my life and in my church life and in my life of faith. And I have to admit that in the wake of those experiences, I lack the trust that I once had in the institution to which I belong. So before I try and answer that question, I do want to acknowledge that, yes, I am a Christian, specifically an Episcopalian. And despite being asked by several of my colleagues and friends why I continue in that tradition after those experiences, I do. And I hope I can share with you a bit of the why. I have been an Episcopalian since birth, which of course brings its own personal bias to this conversation, right? And I realize that in this moment, I'm surrounded by people of many faiths and backgrounds and understandings, both of relationship with the divine and with the world around us. And so I hope that a little bit of what I say might challenge you, and I hope you'll be willing to share with me pieces of your story that will challenge me. And that's where we are. So as you heard, and I'll try to skip over the parts where I wrote, I didn't realize you'd read the bio quite as you did, which is great. I'll try to not give you that twice. But I am a church planter. And if you were to have told me, my young self, even my 30-year-old self, that I would stand before a crowd of people and tell you that I was a church planter, I'd have told you were crazy, right? I did, in fact, tell my bishop that he was crazy to ask for such work. I grew up here, right? Down the street, not far away. I went to school, I went to university, I started a family, I started my career, all in a very small geographic area. And then rather spontaneously, I moved to the Arizona desert. And during the nearly 2 decades that followed, I discerned a call to the priesthood and to growing and leading communities that were centered on what I believe to be the gospel, the good news. And for me, I think the driving force behind that good news remains in this earthly realm, right? The call to love. Love, the verb. Love, the action. And in the Christian Bible, a summary of that call is found in each and every one of the 4 Gospels, right? 3 of which, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, recount Jesus telling various crowds and people that they should understand the greatest of commandments. And as we heard that earlier in the story of the Good Samaritan, it would be the idea that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And then he adds, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. And says that on these 2 commandments hang everything that matters. And throughout his earthly ministry, as recounted in the more expanded text, Jesus shares example upon example of how to carry out those commands, one of which we heard today, and I thank you to our wonderful actors, in the story of the Good Samaritan. Love looks like stopping, helping, nursing back to health, sacrificing financially, right, to ensure the care of your fellow neighbor. And it means doing so even when that person is a Samaritan, which is to say, not one of your people, right? And these are the stories that when we see them in our lives today, we celebrate and we laud and we rejoice in. These are the stories that paint an image of Christianity in the world, or so we hope. In my own experiences, however, and in the work of living those ideals, I find that it's not all that easy in our every action to always show that love and care for the other. If we're honest, parables like this exist in our Christian scriptures because the world has never fully embodied them, right? And when I first moved to Arizona, I took a position as the youth director at a church that was growing exponentially. We did start with 2 kids and 4 pizzas. It's bad when your pizzas outnumber the kids 2 to 1. That's a very challenging meeting. And we grew the group to 75 6th to 12th graders. Now, I will say that that took the period of 9 years, right? It took meeting them at 2 and growing with them until they were 12. But we did do that. And that little tiny group started to attract students from outside of our parish families. And that's when I started to understand the difficulty in showing love. Because what I started to hear back from within the congregation of people I loved was, those aren't our kids. I assured them that they were mine, and they would soon be all of ours. And when I took that group of 30 plus kids to our summer camp one year, I overheard the camp staff talking about Deb's kids. They're just from the suburbs, right? I started to encounter how hard it was to love the people you don't see as part of yourself. And then some of those students came to me explaining that as they get older, their homework is increasing and they have club sports and their parents can't drive and all these things were happening in their world. And by the way, I lived in the city just north of where the church was, where they happened to live. And wouldn't it be great if we had a ministry there? And that's how I found myself planting a church. It was at the request of teenagers. You don't say no to kids who want to go to church, right? And neither did our bishop, thank goodness. I started working alongside the woman who is now my wife, who is an ordained priest. I am not. That is part of the story. And together we became church planters. And ultimately, as we'll get to in a minute, I was asked by our then bishop to run that church on my own and serve as its sole pastor. And in that role, I started to understand more and more deeply how my neighbors were experiencing church. And I do put that in scare quotes. Because during that 2005 to 2008 housing boom, our city, surprise, Arizona, was in contest with Henderson, Nevada, back and forth every month to see which of us was the fastest growing in the country. And it was between the two of us, right? And so as you can imagine, more and more people from more and more diverse areas are moving to town. Or so I thought. And as I would learn later, that population growth brought with it a boom of new church plants. When I last tallied them, there were approximately 65 worshiping congregations in the city of Surprise. They were all Christian. There was not a single other faith represented in brick and mortar form. They were very nearly uniform, with one exception that I'll note in just a second. 2 were Roman Catholic. There were 4 LDS wards. 55 plus of them were a very uniform fundamentalist evangelical theology. There was 1 ELCA church, our little tiny Episcopal church, both of which were church plants. And there is 1 UU congregation. Of all of those churches, all that remains of the open, affirming, and mainline Protestant churches that ascribe to that theology is the UU congregation. So thank you. Our ministry, as it unfolded, found us growing among people who had been previously rejected by the church, often quite publicly, and particularly among LGBTQIA plus youth. They are people who had no religion altogether, oftentimes stemming from the fact that they understood how Christians treated each other. And at one point, a teenager who was a self-proclaimed atheist came explaining his lack of faith, and what he said to me will stick with me forever. He said, "If the way I see Christians acting around me is Christianity, the only ethical choice is to be an atheist." And that became a very defining moment in my ministry and of my understanding of my own call. Because what I realized in that moment was that although I was very tempted to respond to the child and say something akin to, "But we're not all like that," the truth was that in this student's experience and the majority of his friends and family, right, we were. They weren't welcome in the church. And quite frankly, they were being actively taught exactly the opposite. So I've spent the better part of the last decade studying both the impact of that theology, right, on the people that I know and love, and continuing to work to develop a visible and loving community. And in the process, I discovered how not only difficult the work is, but how unsafe it can be. Often spiritually and emotionally, but not only limited to that. It's difficult in the world powers to embrace the people that the world would rather leave alone on the street. And the more visible our community became, the more we began to experience the kind of encounters that our youth had shared. I can recount stories of learning via a barrage of Facebook posts, no less, that God had brought fire to California because the LGBTQIA club we had started was hosting a game night at Starbucks the next day. Still don't understand that one. Within my own diocesan structure, we heard a lot about how they weren't our kids, and that brought an abrupt end to my own discernment process. My wife, who is, as I said, an ordained priest, was moved from the church we planted to a larger downtown church, and that left me alone to lead this congregation. And I think that's, with that background, where I started to really understand what Reverend Tony had asked me to talk about, right? That intersection of my faith, my call, and that decision as to where I was going to place my trust from then on. I asked that we include the hymn Amazing Grace today, which you'll have in just a moment, because the story that inspired its writing has been a source of great inspiration to me. If you're not familiar, it was written by John Newton, right? Himself once the captain of multiple slave trading vessels, turned repentant Anglican priest. And he, in turn, became a mentor to William Wilberforce, who, with a very small, really, portion of other people, went on to give his own life to end the British slave trade. Successfully, as far as they were able to take that, right? And in that, he was called to risk his life, his reputation, his wealth, his health, and do so in pursuance of the work of justice. What's more in that story were the methods by which he did it. The methods by which he brought his fellow countrymen to understand the horrors of the slave trade. It was very direct, it was very demanding, and it was very kind and nonviolent and considerate of the people who would be adversely affected by the end of this trade. Perhaps too much so. But he worked within an established system, right? He and his fellow abolitionists, and they confronted a most overwhelming, powerful system of the day. And they worked from a place of love to change the world. And I think that's the thing. The work of love, it isn't necessarily the work of the world. For me, it's summed up in those commands of Jesus, and I really liked the way the writer of the Gospel of John strengthened that. I'll read it to you from the NRSV because that's the version I use. So we'll have two. He says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. And I think that's the piece that sticks with me. Because in my tradition, as we observe the season of Lent and we walk with Jesus down the mountain into Jerusalem on the same road as that Samaritan, right? We pass into the city gates and on to the garden and ultimately to the cross, right? The thing I place my hope in is what happens next, the part where Jesus' death and crucifixion conquers death and opens the path to eternal life. I've only heard this in a retelling. My wife studied with Yale Professor Miroslav Volf, and according to what her recollection of this quote is, he told the class that the cross is what love looks like in a broken world. And I think that rings true for me, right? Which is to say that it's the most concise understanding I have come to yet as to why I place my trust and faith where I do, and continue in that work to the best of my ability to bring about justice. The cross and the death of the things that we hold dear in the worldly life is what brings about justice. Something to think about. Among the powers of the world, the command to love as actively and unabashedly and passionately as Jesus does as he walks toward that cross. That's a hard ask. It's a very hard ask. And I do think that to do that kind of work will in some ways lead to our own cross. Perhaps not the physical death, especially in this time and place in our world, but it does call us to let go of a lot of the things that we have and need and deserve and all of those things, right? To align with the marginalized in our communities. That often means changing our own expectations of wealth and privilege and prestige and power. It certainly had that effect in my life. And this is the good news part. In my life, it's borne so much fruit. As painful as some of the experiences that I've been through have been, I now have the privilege of watching from afar as the people that we were called to serve have gone on to do wonderful work in the world. I've had the privilege of watching as one young adult spontaneously walked through a parking lot and sat down with the man on the corner, sitting on the curb, learned that he was unhoused, learned what it was he needed in that moment, didn't just offer him a sandwich, but what it turned out was she had a conversation and he needed interview clothes for an interview the next day. And all of a sudden, within an hour, had activated our little community to provide just those. That work doesn't have to be enormous, but it was impactful. I've watched teenagers become parents. I've watched them trying to raise their children committed to the ideals they learned as teenagers. I've seen people simply commit to learning from one another's stories in an attempt to change their own bias and learn from others, and then to courageously go and act on behalf of the people from whom they've learned. In short, this work has borne a lot of fruit. Love, albeit sometimes in very small portions, right? Love is made manifest in the world when we do those little things. And it's in that I place my trust, in the promise that love itself can overcome even death. For me, in this moment, what that looks like is continuing to lead youth and young adults now in a new community and starting over. Although I did start with more than 2 kids, still 4 pizzas. It looks like upon being laid off from my position a year ago and having nothing to do, I decided to use my crafting skills to start designing pieces that people could carry, that affirmed their own identity, that you could gift to one another to say, I see you. It's not really big, but it's something I can do. And the more I put myself out there and that name out there, the more I hear the same comments as before. So within the church and within my own institution, I think Reverend Tony was correct. I think that call, especially following Bishop Buddy's sermon, right? I think it's a very good example of why I do what I do and why I continue despite the things that have happened. It's an example of the work that Jesus began, the work that mere mortals like Newton and Wilberforce continued, and the work that many in our community, as the helpers they are, continue to do today. I think in specific regard to Bishop Buddy, her courageous words, they were just a simple call to show mercy, right? Something I hope we would do every day in and out. But that took courage. It took a lot of courage in the time and place and setting and within the institution. It took a lot of courage. In her example, I do find hope for the structures of our world. I'm not ready to claim that I'm going to put my trust back in those structures wholeheartedly, but I am deeply encouraged by those examples and the examples of every person that does their best to move that needle closer and closer to justice and love. So, in closing, it's my hope that despite our differences, we can come together as individuals, as communities, right? And inside our immediate circles, that we can strengthen one another and find the courage to go out there and do the thing. So with that, I thank you. Thank you for having me today. Thank you for sharing with me. I hope you will share and challenge me in return. And I hope that together within our local streets, we might continue to engage in this work.
Please rise as you are able for the hymn of celebration, Amazing Grace, number 205 in the hymnal, if anyone uses a hymnal.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Many dangers, toils, and snares I have already known. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. We've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun.
And now join me with the words to the extinguishment of our flame. We extinguish this flame, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry out into the world until we are together again. This concludes our service. Thank you to Deb for that sermon. Thanks to Jerry, as always. Thanks to Reverend Sierra Marie. Thanks to Melody Levy for doing the cover to the order of service, as she always does. Thanks to Sherry from the tech team. Thanks to our greeters, our ushers, Randy and Jane. They always do such a wonderful job. And I saw Annie earlier in the kitchen. Thanks to Annie and anyone else who always helps to get coffee hour ready. And thanks to the buildings and grounds team for making sure the lights come on every week the way they do. And thanks to everyone who had anything to do with making this happen. That includes everybody here and everybody who logged on. Thank you.